always believed my family was perfect. My mother was the heart of our home, always making sure everything felt warm and comforting. My father, a man I admired, worked hard and provided for us. To the outside world, we were the ideal family, laughing at dinner, going on trips, and sharing moments that felt real. My mother had to leave for a few days to take care of my grandmother, who had fallen sick. She packed carefully, ensuring my father and I had everything we needed while she was away. She kissed my forehead, hugged my father, and left with a smile. At first, nothing seemed unusual. My father and I ate dinner together, watched TV, and talked about random things. But soon I noticed subtle changes. He seemed distracted, checking his phone more than usual. He would step outside to take calls, speaking in a lower tone than normal. His laughter felt forced, and at times, his eyes darted toward me as if gauging whether I had noticed anything. One evening, as I sat doing my homework, I saw my father looking at the clock repeatedly. He seemed restless, pacing around the living room. His phone buzzed, and he immediately grabbed it, responding quickly before putting it down. There was a nervous energy around him, something I couldn't quite place. Then, out of nowhere, he looked at me and smiled. Too wide, too fake. "I have some work to take care of. I'll be in my room," he said before disappearing upstairs. Something didn't feel right. Not long after my father went upstairs, I heard the faint sound of a door opening. His footsteps were quick, almost hurried. I wasn't sure why, but a strange feeling settled in my chest. I stayed still listening. Moments later, the doorbell rang. It was soft, almost hesitant, as if the person on the other side didn't want to be heard. I expected my father to call me to answer it, but he rushed downstairs before I could even move. He paused for a second, glanced toward where I was sitting, then opened the door just enough for someone to slip inside. A woman stepped in. She was well-dressed, her hair neatly done, her movements confident. She wasn't a stranger to my father. That much was clear. They didn't speak at first. Instead, they just stood there, staring at each other like they were having a silent conversation. Then, my father closed the door behind her. I held my breath. There was something too familiar in the way they looked at each other, in the way my father's shoulders relaxed around her. He wasn't nervous anymore. He was comfortable. That was what made it worse. They moved toward the living room, unaware that I was still there. I watched as my father placed his hand on her arm, gently, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She smiled, tilting her head slightly, her eyes filled with something I didn't want to name. I could hear them now. Their voices were soft, not urgent, not rushed, just easy. They talked like they had done this before, like this wasn't new. My stomach tightened. I didn't need to hear the words to understand what was happening. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. A part of me kept hoping I was wrong, that there was some other explanation. But deep down, I knew. My father had let another woman into our home, into our lives, like it was normal. Like my mother didn't exist. A lump formed in my throat. My fingers curled into fists. I didn't know what to do. Confront him? Leave? Pretend I never saw any of this? No matter what, one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. My hands felt cold. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to move, to do something, but my body wouldn't listen. Instead, I just sat there, listening to them talk like this was normal, like my mother's absence had created a space they were too eager to fill. I caught fragments of their conversation. They spoke about meeting again, about how careful they needed to be. The woman laughed softly, and my father joined in, his voice lighter than I had heard in weeks. He wasn't acting nervous anymore. He was at ease, as if this was where he truly wanted to be. I clenched my fists. My father, the man I respected, the man who always told me honesty mattered, was lying. Not just to my mother, but to me. The warmth I once felt in our home suddenly felt like a cruel illusion. A sudden wave of anger pushed me forward. Before I knew it, I stepped out from where I had been watching. The moment my father saw me, his face changed. His smile vanished. His body tensed. The woman turned slowly, eyes widening as if she had just realized I had been there all along. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence was heavier than anything I had ever felt before. My father opened his mouth to say something, but I beat him to it. "Who is she?" My voice was steadier than I expected, but inside, I was breaking. He hesitated. I could see the war in his eyes, the battle between lies and the truth. "She's a friend," he finally said. A pathetic excuse. A weak attempt to cover what I had already seen. I let out a bitter laugh. "A friend? Is that what Mom would call hers?" His face paled. He took a step forward, but I took a step back. I didn't want him near me. The woman shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing she had stayed too long. She grabbed her purse and muttered something about leaving. My father didn't stop her. He just stood there, staring at me, waiting. "Does Mom know?" I asked. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it. He looked away. That was all the confirmation I needed. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I turned and walked away, leaving my father standing in the middle of the room, drowning in the silence he had created. I locked myself in my room, my mind racing. My father's face, his hesitation, the guilt in his eyes, it was all playing on repeat. I wanted to scream, to cry, to pretend none of this had happened, but there was no escaping it. The truth was out, and now I had to decide what to do with it. Telling my mother meant destroying her world, shattering the life she had built with him. But staying silent felt just as heavy. I had seen everything. I knew what kind of man my father really was now. Pretending otherwise wouldn't change that. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, the way he looked at her, the way he never looked at my mother anymore. Morning came too fast, and with it, the weight of reality. My mother was coming back today. I sat at the table, staring at my untouched breakfast, waiting. When she walked in, smiling and tired, I felt my stomach twist. She hugged me, kissed my forehead, and asked how everything was. My father stood behind her, silent, watching me carefully. He knew I held a secret now, and I could see the fear in his eyes. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to rip the truth out and let it fall between us, but the words wouldn't come. My mother looked so happy to be home, so unaware of the storm waiting to destroy her peace. I hated my father for putting me in this position. Days passed and I stayed quiet. My father tried to act normal, like nothing had changed, but I could feel the shift. I avoided him, barely spoke unless necessary. The distance between us grew, and he knew why. He had lost my trust, and there was no fixing it. The guilt of not telling my mother stayed with me, but so did the fear of what would happen if I did. Would she leave him? Would she stay and pretend, just like I was doing now? Either way, nothing would ever be the same.